I learned a lot in my garden this year. I tried some new things. I tried to improve on things that I've done in the past. And I discovered some things that I wasn't even looking to discover. Join me today as I share with you some of those lessons learned in my garden in this growing season. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott. Now, I've been gardening for more than 30 years, and every year I learn more about gardening. I think gardening is just one of those activities that you can spend a lifetime learning, and you still won't know everything you need to know. For me, in my Colorado Zone 5B garden, I'm just a couple days away from the first freeze of my autumn. I like to take this time of year to do some analysis, to start thinking about what happened in my garden this year. And while some plants are still growing and others are starting to fade, it's a great opportunity to look and spend some time to decide what happened, what didn't work the way it was supposed to, and more importantly, what lessons can be learned from the garden as a whole and with some individual plants. Many gardening successes can be predicted, and when it turns out the way that you had planned, well, that's a great example of something to learn from. My peppers are performing better this year than they have in many recent years. I expected that. This was the very first bed that I built in this garden 3 years ago. I filled it with good soil, and I've made a really good effort to amend this soil with organic matter every single year. So as my young garden grows, this is the bed that I would expect to have the best soil. And no doubt it does. These pepper plants are beautiful. The fruit on the plant that's reaching the full maturity is large. It's beautiful. I haven't had any disease issues. I haven't even had any pest issues. This is one of those things that tells me focusing on the soil is important. I don't use any fertilizers, none at all in this bed. It's all a result of the good soil. Chalk that up as a great lesson to learn. Some lessons are completely unexpected. I spent a lot of time and effort building this fully enclosed garden area. It's to keep the deer out, it's to keep mala out from stealing the tomatoes, and it allows me to cover this entire section with hail cloth. I have a big problem with hail in the summer, and it's devastated my garden in the past. First off, it works beautifully at keeping the deer out, keeping mala out, and keeping the hail off of my plants. But this year I've had a huge problem with mice eating my tomatoes. I've never had mice eat so many tomatoes in my garden before. And as I analyze it, it's because of this beautiful structure I built. It's keeping out the natural predators that used to take care of my mice. Mala is a great mouser, and during the peak of the season, a week doesn't go by that she doesn't bring 2 or 3 mice into the house. I know that there's a cat that roams this area at night, and I'm pretty sure in recent years it's done a great job keeping the mice under control. And I've got hawks and owls in the area that no doubt are feeding on the mice, if they can get to them. In this enclosed space, they can't get to the mice. So the mice that are surviving the attacks find their way here. They're looking for something to eat. What do they find? My tomatoes. So while this structure was built for a particular purpose to protect my plants, in actuality, it's created a new problem. One of the reasons that I built this arch in my garden was to grow vining flowers up to attract pollinators and hummingbirds. This year it worked beautifully with the firecracker vines. They're starting to fade right now, but at their peak, the hummingbirds were coming to these plants on a daily basis, sucking up the nectar. Wonderful sight to see these flowers and these birds working together. This was one of those plans that actually happened exactly the way I wanted it to. And now, as this plant fades, I can collect the seeds and do it all again next year. I did the same thing in my pollinator garden last year. I collected the seeds at the end of the season and just spread them all over. The result, especially with these cosmos, they like this area and they're popping up all over, all these different colors of the different plants in all the different areas. I love it. You think I'm going to do it again next year? Absolutely. I'm trying something new in one of my green stock vertical planters this year, and I think I'll repeat it in years ahead. It's all about saving the seeds of these plants and avoiding cross-pollination. I'm growing these plants in my main garden, but in the garden I've got some concern about cross-pollination. While beans usually pollinate themselves, because I've got so many beans growing close together, cross-pollination could be a problem. But by having these rattlesnake beans separated from the rest of the garden, I can virtually eliminate my cross-pollination concerns. The same with peppers. Peppers will usually pollinate themselves, but in my beautiful pepper bed, I've got half a dozen different types of peppers growing. That increases the likelihood of cross-pollination. Not when you separate the plants and give distance from those possible insects that could be doing the cross-pollination. Along with the Napa cabbage and the cilantro, I'll be collecting these seeds and feel pretty confident that I can plant them next year and get the same plants that I began with. I tried some new plants this year, like this Armenian pale green cucumber and this Bait Alpha cucumber. Now, before putting these in the ground, I did learn that these aren't actually cucumbers. This Armenian cucumber is actually a gourd. It looks like a cucumber and kind of tastes like a cucumber. I think it's much crunchier than a cucumber. This Bait Alpha cucumber is a pale green. It tastes pretty much like a cucumber, but it has a size limit. It only gets 5, maybe 6 inches long. I still prefer my Market More varieties and the straight 8. So while both of these did pretty well in my garden, I have no intention of growing them again. I'll go back to some of those varieties that I've had success with and that I like better. Another lesson that I really didn't want to learn has to deal with this whole garden space. This is only the 3rd year that I've been growing here. And in the last 2 years, the garden was much smaller. I had no issue with deer in this area of the garden. This year, they found it. These cattle panel hoops, I think, saved a lot of my plants. But when it came to this kale, anything that was sticking out of the hoop, the deer ate. The kale recovered pretty well over the course of the season, but I had a similar problem with these peppers. It wasn't the deer, it was Mala coming in and stealing the young peppers. She likes to chew on them. So I covered the same cattle panel hoops with bird netting, and that was able to keep Mala out, keep the deer out, and keep these peppers growing. And so a project that I had really hoped to avoid, and I'll have to do it either in the next couple of months before winter sets in or first thing in spring, is to enclose this garden, to put a fence all the way around it to keep the deer and Mala out. I'm not planning on covering it, so hopefully the predators will be able to take care of the mice and I won't have a mice problem in this area. But I need to deal with the deer and Mala so that I can have the harvest I want. This was the first year that I started growing a few plants here in my new greenhouse. I just have a couple cherry tomato plants. They did great. I also had a pretty good growth of potato plants, but this is where one of those lessons come in that you don't expect. I didn't plant potatoes. This was the first year of improving the soil, and I used the grow bag soil from the potatoes that I grew last year. Well, apparently in those grow bags were little tiny potatoes that I didn't see when I was harvesting. those little itty bitty potatoes sprouted up in this soil. And I had a pretty good potato crop. I also had some success with my pepper plants in the greenhouse, though this soil isn't nearly as good as the soil in the other bed, which I think is why those other peppers did better. But I'm very happy with this plant. This is a Hungarian pepper. This is the type of pepper that is used to make paprika, and it's done very well. My plan is to save the seeds from these peppers, grow a whole bunch of them next year, and make my own paprika. I know that many plants can be quite resilient in the garden, and I like to practice a live and let live philosophy. If the plant wants to live, I usually let it. But earlier this year, I did a video where I talked about sometimes you just have to let the plants go. You have to take them out because they're not doing well enough. This plant, this apple tree, had been eaten by deer, and actually not on a little bit by mala after the deer got to it. So I planted this tree instead, expecting that this one was completely dead. It surprised me. It's growing pretty strong, and this tree has been in the garden a little over 2 years now. So instead of writing it off, it wants to grow. It's growing. So I'm just going to dig it up and move it to another area of my garden where I can let it grow at its own pace. I've gained some height with this young tree. It may fruit earlier, but this tree deserves to live, so I'm going to let it. I was a little surprised by the lesson that these tomatillos taught me. This is my Salsa Garden bed, and it's done great this year. I have the tomatillos at the back of the bed, and they'll usually grow taller and wider than tomatoes, and they did. The tomatoes are just in front. What I failed to fully take into account was that the tomatoes would grow faster than the tomatillos. So the tomatoes in front of these plants shaded out these young plants. So they grew slower. I should be harvesting tomatillos right now, and there's a ton of tomatillos on this plant, but that early shading from the tomato plants was enough to slow their growth. So I'm probably not going to get a harvest at all this year. The next time I grow tomatillos, I'm going to grow them by themselves in full sun with no shade so that I can get the harvest that I'm looking for. One of the things that keeps gardening so interesting to me is that you never know where all of your lessons are going to come from. Sure, I suspected that this Swiss chard and these peppers and these onions would do well because this is good soil, better than some of the soil in other areas of my garden. But some of those other lessons I've shared with you today, I had no idea that I would be talking about them at the end of the season. So take a look at your own garden, your own plants, your own soil, your own plan, and see what lessons you've learned from the season that's just ending, or maybe just beginning. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.